Welcome to The Test is History, a graphic excursion into Test cricket's most marvellous encounters. This episode focuses on Test number 73, the fourth Test of the 1902 series between England and Australia, which took place at Old Trafford Cricket Ground, Manchester, from the 24th to the 26th of July 1902. Australia arrived in England that summer, having held the Ashes for 4 years, following a 4-1 home victory in 1897 to 1898. Joe Darling had achieved further series wins in England and Australia. He now led them into this tour. In the first test of the series, the first ever to take place at Edgbaston, Birmingham, Australia had been dismissed for a record low 36. England's wicket-takers were George Hurst and Wilfred Rhodes, who both hailed from the small town of Kirkeaton in Yorkshire. Rain intervened to ensure Australia escaped with a draw. The Lord's Test was also a victim of the English summer, but then Australia beat England at Bramall Lane, Sheffield, courtesy of a century by Clem Hill and 11 wickets from Monty Noble. A win in the fourth Test would seal the series and enable Australia to retain the Ashes. With so much hinging on the result at Old Trafford, England made changes. C.B. Fry had suffered a finger injury while fielding for Hampshire against the Australian tourists, so withdrew from the match. Elsewhere, the selection choices were more controversial and suggested a growing chasm between the England Selection Committee, led by Chairman of Selectors, Old Etonian Lord Hawke, who was captain and president of Yorkshire, and England's captain, Archie McLaren, an old Harrovian who was skipper of Lancashire. Characteristically, one of the controversies involved the arch-professional Sydney Barnes. Barnes had been taken on the tour to Australia, enjoying success with 19 wickets in the 3 tests he played before being troubled by a knee injury. Tensions arose between Barnes and McLaren, with Barnes complaining that McLaren was over-bowling him. Barnes relied on cricket for a living. Growing up in industrial Smethwick, he had seen his father's servitude at a metal bashing company offer scant reward. Sydney Barnes refused to accept the same fate, but his attitude was an affront to the cricketing establishment, not least his captain McLaren. During a storm at sea on their journey, McLaren was heard to comment, "If we go down, at least that so-and-so Barnes will go down with us." But Barnes' talent ensured he could not remain excluded. On seeing the Sheffield pitch, McLaren, seemingly without the selection board's consent, sent a telegram to Barnes, inviting him to play. Barnes arrived late on the morning of the test, but responded with 6 first-innings wickets, despite being barracked by the crowd, who had seen him replace local favourite Yorkshire's Schofield Hay. Admittedly, Barnes was less effective in Australia's second innings. Perhaps his knee injury was still troubling him. Following the defeat, England's selection panel met without McLaren. Barnes was not retained for Old Trafford, nor would he be for the next 5 years. On the knowledge that he could earn more in the Lancashire League, Barnes left county cricket for good, but even from the fringes of club cricket, he could not be ignored, and his country would eventually call upon his services. If Lord Hawke was infuriated by McLaren's late omission of the highly rated Yorkshire bowler Schofield Hay at Sheffield, it was reciprocated. The previous winter, Lord Hawke had refused permission for 2 of his other Yorkshire players, George Hurst and Wilfred Rhodes, to be considered for selection for the Ashes tour. Back in England, the successful return of Hurst and Rhodes to the national team was leaving Yorkshire under strength for their county fixtures. Despite Schofield Hay's accuracy and expertise on wet wickets, Lord Hawke did not offer him to McLaren for Old Trafford. Instead, to McLaren's consternation, Hay played alongside Lord Hawke for Yorkshire at Worcester. Another notable omission was Gloucestershire all-rounder Gilbert Jessop, nicknamed the Croucher for his low batting stance. Jessop had been dismantling county bowling attacks. He was renowned for his big hitting and was a superb cover fielder. Jessop was another player favoured by McLaren, but not by the selectors. McLaren later claimed that he wrote to the selectors with 2 rejected suggestions. Whatever those were, the story goes that on seeing the 12 players he had to choose from, McLaren's words were, "My God, look what they've given me." The England 12 contained 2 debutants. Somerset amateur Lionel Palliret was to open the innings. Palliret's form over the season had been poor, but he had scored 90 against the visiting Australians for his county. Fred Tate, the Sussex medium pacer, was seen as a wet wicket specialist, ideal for the conditions in Manchester. Although late in his career, he was enjoying an excellent season and was on his way to 180 first-class wickets. Tate was a last-minute call-up. Some even believed that his inclusion was the selectors' attempt to further limit McLaren's influence, not believing that McLaren would pick Tate even on a wet wicket, thus ensuring their chosen 11 took the field. If the selection committee's mechanisations deserve censure, Archie McLaren was far from blameless. McLaren still had the say on which of the players selected would be left out on the day of the match. One of Lord Hawke's Yorkshire contingent in the squad was the famous all-rounder George Hurst. Hurst's bowling had helped skittle Australia out for 36 in the first test at Edgbaston, but he had been out of form in the Sheffield test, having returned match figures of no wickets for 99 runs. He'd also suffered 2 failures with the bat. And so, on the day of the match, and Fred Tate's 35th birthday, McLaren controversially dropped Hurst and handed Tate his debut. Was the omission of Hurst McLaren's attempt to spite Lord Hawke for not giving him the team he wanted? It was a decision that would reverberate for years to come. England's chosen team was as follows: Palliret, Abel, McLaren, Tildesley and Ranjit Singh were the specialist batsmen. Jackson and Braund were the all-rounders, batting at 6 and 7. Dick Lilly, the wicket-keeper, batted at 8. Lockwood, Rhodes and Tate, specialist bowlers, formed the tail. For Australia, Trumper and Duff would open the batting. Hill, Noble, Gregory and Darling formed the middle order, followed by all-rounders Hopkins and Armstrong at 7 and 8. Wicket-keeper James Kelly at 9 and specialist bowlers Trumble and Saunders at 10 and 11. The pitch, already softened by the Manchester rain, was likely to deteriorate as the match wore on. Australia opted to bat after winning the toss. The run-up was so slippery that England's pace bowler, Bill Lockwood, was unable to bowl for the first hour. McLaren's plan was to stem the flow of runs in the first session through defensive field placings while conditions worsened for batting. He was thwarted by the genius of Victor Trumper. Trumper's natural ability was in evidence from childhood. Back in 1894 in Trumper's hometown of Sydney, Andrew Stoddart's visiting England team had invited local youngsters to bowl at them in the nets. Trumper appeared and the English tourists were informed of his talents with the bat, so invited young Victor to bat against their test bowling attack of Lockwood, Richardson, Peel and Briggs. The England team, who went on to triumph in that particular Ashes series, were united in their opinion that Victor Trumper would one day become the greatest batsman in the world. Even in a time when those fortunate enough to witness him play have long since passed on, Trumper remains the incarnation of batting elegance and artistry. He was to become the most popular Australian cricketer of his era, perhaps of all time, idolised by the public and loved by his contemporaries for his unaffected modesty and generosity of spirit. His innings in this match was one of his most iconic. Trumper and Reggie Duff attacked the bowling from the outset and put on a century stand. Duff had announced himself to Test cricket with a sensational century on debut at Melbourne earlier that year. His career was a short one. bookended with another 100 on his final test in 1905. But alcoholism was to affect Duff's game. He was to leave cricket before the age of 30 and died in poverty at 33 in 1911. Trumper would himself pay for much of the cost of Duff's funeral. The outfield had now dried enough to enable Bill Lockwood to run in. After just over an hour and a quarter, with 135 already on the scorecard, Lockwood had Duff caught by wicket-keeper Dick Lilly. Trumper was joined by the famous South Australian left-hander Clem Hill, and the onslaught continued. A famous century was completed by Trumper, and Australia were an incredible 173 for 1 by lunch. England's 24-year-old slow left armour Wilfred Rhodes had conceded plenty of runs in the morning session. However, Rhodes was an admirer of Thomas Edison, and his approach to bowling was as systematic as the methods employed by the American inventor. To Rhodes, the taking of wickets, such as Trumper's, was a puzzle to be solved. Straight after lunch, Rhodes had Trumper caught by Lilly. Monty Noble and Sid Gregory quickly followed him to the pavilion, with Rhodes claiming both wickets. Clem Hill was joined by Joe Darling, and both made half-centuries, but by now the pitch was drying out and becoming sticky. From 256 for 4, Australia collapsed to 299 all out. Rhodes, the leading wicket-taker in the county championship for the previous 2 seasons, had come back well with 4 wickets, including those of Trumper and Darling. Jackson, Tate and Brawns had gone wicketless. But England's most impressive return came from pace bowler Bill Lockwood, who took 6 for 48. Lockwood hailed from Nottinghamshire and had appeared as a batsman for his native county in 1886 and 1887, in the days before the county championship when he was still in his teens. In 1889 he joined Surrey and continued to show promise with the bat, but in 1891, with Surrey requiring bowlers, Lockwood stepped forth and enjoyed considerable success as a pace bowler in an attack which contained England internationals George Lohman and Tom Richardson. Lockwood's form saw him selected for England in 1893 when he took 6 wickets on debut at Lord's. But a poor tour of Australia in 1894 to 1895 saw his career spiral into decline. This was reflected in his personal life, where he suffered the tragedy of the deaths of his wife and child. Lockwood turned to drinking alcohol, his weight increased and his form declined to the point that he was dropped by Surrey. But 1898 saw Lockwood's revival begin. Remarried and now much slimmer, his bowling and batting improved considerably. He was recalled for the Oval Test of 1899, taking 7 for 71 in the first innings. In 1902, he had been selected for the first 2 tests of the series, but the wet weather had prevented him from bowling. Controversially left out of the Sheffield Test, at Old Trafford he would make the most of his opportunity. England's first innings was opened by Lionel Pallaret, making his debut, and Bobby Abel playing in what would be his final Test match. The 44-year-old Abel had enjoyed an impressive career for Surrey and England, making his debut back in 1888, when he had opened the innings with W.G. Grace. His highest score for his country came at Sydney in 1892, a first innings 132 not out in a losing effort. He had featured in Ashes successes in 1888 and 1896. However, in this innings, he was dismissed by Jack Saunders for 6, as was Lionel Pallaret, leaving England struggling on 13 for 2. Saunders was a medium-paced left-arm spinner whose delivery action involved a sharp flick of the wrist. At the outset of this tour, this had brought into question its legality. An article in the London Sportsman had appeared insinuating that Saunders' teammate Monty Noble had a suspect action. Following this, a letter had been written to umpire Jim Phillips, who was not officiating this match but had stood in the first and third tests. The letter advised Phillips, who had a vigilant record against bowlers delivering the ball with a crooked arm, that he could make a name for himself if he were to no-ball Monty Noble and Jack Saunders. Phillips showed the letter to the Australian side, who were outraged. The accuser was none other than Jack Worrell, captain of Victoria, for whom Saunders played. Worrell had featured in 11 tests for Australia, but had been left out for this tour. The Australian team, led by their captain Joe Darling, successfully demanded that the Sportsman print no more articles by Worrell. On their return to Australia, Saunders and fellow Victorian Warwick Armstrong even refused to play under Worrell, ending the latter's cricket career. In the event, Phillips did not no-ball Jack Saunders or Monty Noble, although it has been speculated that the accusation was the reason that 1902 was Jack Saunders' only tour of England. Nevertheless, his international record remains impressive. Saunders was to add the wicket of Johnny Tildesley to his tally, after Hugh Trumble had dismissed England captain Archie McLaren and K.S. Ranjit Singh. The fall of Tildesley left the England innings on a precarious 44 for 5. Stanley Jackson and Len Brauns were to steady the ship, so that England reached close of play without further loss and with 70 on the scoreboard. The second day followed a similar pattern to that of the first, with the batters making hay before the bowlers got on top. Jackson and Brauns enjoyed a 6th wicket stand of 141 before Brauns was bowled by Monty Noble for 65, leaving England's hopes resting on the shoulders of Stanley Jackson. Like his captain, McLaren, Jackson was an old Harrovian. At Harrow, the young Winston Churchill had been Jackson's fag, the English boarding school term for a younger boy who acts as a servant for a prefect. Later in life, Jackson followed Churchill into politics and was introduced by Churchill to the then Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who greeted him by exclaiming, "I've been looking all my life for the man who gave Winston Churchill a hiding at school." Along with his teammate in this test, K.S. Ranjit Singh, Jackson had gone on to Trinity College, Cambridge. As Cambridge University captain, Jackson had been responsible for giving Ranji his blue when he selected him for the first 11. Jackson was an all-rounder whose business commitments prevented him from ever touring Australia. A fast medium bowler of some repute, he took over 750 first-class wickets in his career for Cambridge University, Yorkshire and England. But at international level, it is his batting record that stands out, with an average of close to 50 in his 20 tests, all played against Australia on home soil. In this test, Jackson reached 128, batting with the tail, and was last man out as England closed on 262. Jackson was dismissed by Australia's tall off-spinner, Hugh Trumble, who was a veteran of 4 previous tours of England. Trumble took 4 wickets in the England's first innings, and ominously for the hosts, was renowned for being deadly on wet wickets like that of Old Trafford. England were 37 runs behind in the first innings, so would need a good bowling performance to keep alive their hopes of regaining the Ashes. Bill Lockwood got England off to the perfect start. He had the danger man, Trumper, caught by Len Brauns before skittling out Clem Hill and Reggie Duff, leaving Australia 10 for 3. Australian captain Joe Darling was joined at the crease by Sid Gregory, and the pivotal moment of the match was about to occur. McLaren had opted for a field with 7 men on the leg side. As Darling was a left-hander, while Gregory batted right-handed, McLaren had to move 5 of his fielders each time a single was taken. To further McLaren's difficulties, he claimed his great friend Ranji was dead lame, although this is disputed. Ranji had only returned to England from India in May. The reason for his journey had nominally been to attend a funeral, but it was also a vain attempt to secure financial backing. Off the pitch, Ranji was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Unsurprisingly, this was affecting his performance. The Somerset all-rounder, Len Brawns, was bowling to the left-handed Joe Darling and getting some spin on the ball with his leg breaks, which made McLaren believe the shots of Darling would carry behind the square leg boundary, and there, by the fence, is where he positioned Fred Tate. The reason for this remains a mystery. Some claim that McLaren didn't want amateurs such as Stanley Jackson, Ranjit Singh or Lionel Pallarette to have to cross the field when a professional could do so. Brawns later claimed he wanted his Somerset teammate, Pallarette, who had been fielding at square leg, to cross the grounds. This is contradicted by McLaren's account, which claimed Brawns wished for Pallarette to field in front of Tate. McLaren's account was supported by his friend, the young Australian player Warwick Armstrong, who was waiting to come into bat. What cannot be doubted is that Fred Tate, usually a slip fielder, was fielding in the unfamiliar position of deep square leg, a vital position for when a leg break bowler like Len Brawns would be bowling to an aggressive left-hander such as Joe Darling. And with Australia on 16 for 3, Darling got down on one knee and skied a slug sweep in the direction of Fred Tate. The ball hung high in the air, fluttering in the wind before descending on Tate. The Manchester crowd waited with bated breath, ready to explode into raucous celebration at the fall of a fourth Australian wicket. And then the gasp of disappointment. Poor hands or poor positioning. McLaren later described Tate as getting behind the catch. He made a forlorn attempt with his left hand, but the ball did not stick. The ball fell out of Tate's grasp and harmlessly onto the grass. Darling had been given a reprieve, and he was to make Australia's top score in their second innings. From 16 for 3 at the point of the dropped catch, Australia reached 64 before Tate went some way to redeeming himself by trapping Gregory LBW for 24. The tourists were at 74 when Pallarette caught Darling off the bowling of Wilfred Rhodes for 37. In a match which was increasingly favouring the bowlers, these were crucial runs. It was a captain's innings from Joe Darling, who had already led Australia to Ashes victory in Australia the previous winter, as well as 3 years ago on English soil in 1899. Lockwood dismissed Hopkins and Noble to reach 11 wickets in the match. Rhodes bowled out the tall Victorian Warwick Armstrong. Australia finished the day on 85 for 8, with wicketkeeper James Kelly and Hugh Trumble in, and number 11 Jack Saunders yet to bat. The next day, it rained solidly for 5 hours in the morning. Just before midday, on a sodden pitch, play resumed. Almost immediately, Tate got his second wicket, that of Trumble, before Rhodes cleaned up the innings when Jack Saunders was caught by Tildesley off his bowling. Australia were all out for just 86, setting England a small but significant target of 124 on what was now a treacherous wicket for batting. Nerves were eased as Pallarette and McLaren made a solid start, but with 44 on the score sheet, Saunders bowled Pallarette. Johnny Tildesley entered the fray and helped take the score to 68 before being caught by Armstrong, again off the bowling of Saunders. Then Hugh Trumble had his first victim, and an important one it was. Skipper McLaren was caught in the deep by Duff for 35, leaving the score at 72 for 3, and the target of 124 still some distance away. It was indeed a cataclysmic moment. McLaren reportedly threw his bat across the dressing room, furious with himself, claiming he'd thrown away the match and the whole bloody rubber. KS Ranjit Singh was joined by Bobby Abel at the crease. In the county championship, Abel was on his way to becoming the season's top run scorer for the 5th time. the small and serious Abel, known as the Governor, helped push England towards the target. If Abel was a popular player, Ranji was an icon of the game, a batting genius to rival his Australian opponent Victor Trumper. 6 years earlier, on this same ground, Ranji had scored 154 not out on his Test debut, but now his fortunes had taken a serious downturn. Chased by creditors and facing financial ruin, he was clearly in no state of mind to be playing Test cricket. Short of confidence, he seemed bewildered by the pitch and the bowling of Trumble. Ranji survived a shower break and several LBW appeals, while Abel took the lead. 20 more runs were added, but then Trumble finally had an appeal upheld. Ranji was gone, LBW for 4. The Australian side had never seen him play so poorly. It was to be his final innings in Test cricket. 5 runs later, Trumble also drew the curtain on Bobby Abel's Test career, bowling him for 21. England were 97 for 5, still 27 runs short of their target. The hero of the first innings, Jackson, was next to depart, caught by Gregory off the bowling of Saunders for 7. Braun missed a delivery by Trumble and was stumped by Kelly for 3. England were 109 for 7, 15 runs from victory. The rain started, but play continued. The crowd gave bowling champion Bill Lockwood a tremendous ovation as he went in to bat, but he was clean bowled by Trumble without scoring. England were 109 for 8. Wilfred Rhodes came in at 10. Rhodes was selected for his bowling, but his batting potential was beginning to reveal itself. At the other end, England's wicketkeeper, Dick Lilly, should have been run out, but a poor throw from Clem Hill gave him a reprieve. Had Hill, Australia's batting hero at Bramall Lane, cost his team the Test? England found themselves with just 8 runs to win. At that point, Lilly hit Trumble high to leg for what looked like more vital runs. From the boundary rope, Clem Hill gave chase, covering 25 yards before going airborne to take a spectacular one-handed catch. Hill had memorably atoned for the run-out error, and England were 116 for 9. They needed 8 runs. Australia needed 1 wicket. In came Fred Tate. The rain came again, causing the players to leave the pitch. Tension hung heavy in the air, with time running out, but play resumed after 3/4 of an hour. With Rhodes failing to score from the remaining 4 balls of Trumble's over at 5 minutes to 6, Tate took guard to the bowling of Jack Saunders. The ball came in. Tate saw something hit the ground and heard a click. He'd edged the first ball towards the boundary. Australian fielder Warwick Armstrong failed to prevent the ball crossing the line, but the extra run meant that Tate, not Rhodes, remained on strike. Another boundary would win the game for the hosts. 3 runs would result in an unprecedented tie. Rain clouds were still threatening, and the match might yet be washed out, resulting in a draw. What would happen? Could Fred Tate banish the memory of his dropped catch the previous day? Tate blocked Saunders. If he could see the over out, Rhodes would be on strike to knock off the remaining runs. Jack Saunders ran in again. This time, the ball was a quicker, swinging delivery. It kept low and skidded onto the stumps of poor Fred Tate. Tate was out for 4. England had lost the match by 3 runs. Australia had won the Ashes. Forlorn, Fred Tate left the field to the jeers of some spectators. Within moments, the rain was pouring down. In the dressing room, Tate was inconsolable. He broke down again in the station waiting room on his journey home. Len Braun, who was travelling with him, told him it would all be forgotten in a week or so. Tate replied that it never would. These words proved sadly far-sighted. The match became known as Tate's match. He would never play for England again. Across generations, Tate became known as Poor Fred Tate, blamed for costing England the match in his only test. It was said that he was never the same man again, his life blighted by financial setbacks, his self-worth shattered by the ignominy of costing England the Ashes. But the result had many architects. Several players had done more to win the game for Australia than Tate had to lose it for England. There was Hugh Trumble, who on his final tour of England would finish with 26 wickets from his 3 tests, 10 of them coming in this match. There was Clem Hill, who had taken the famous catch to dismiss Lilly. And of course there was Victor Trumper, whose batting artistry ensured a level of immortality, although he himself was sadly not blessed with long life. He died of Bright's disease in 1915, aged 38. If blame needed apportioning, there were other culpable individuals. The decisions of the selectors had been questionable. McLaren's leadership had been found wanting. England's overall second innings batting performance was poor. Ranjit Singh's abject. If poor Fred Tate's luck deserted him that day, it would seem his gift for visionary statements had not. According to legend, on the long journey home, Tate looked up to Len Braund and said, "I've got a little kid at home who'll make it up for me." Fred Tate was proved right. His son, Maurice Tate, then only 7 years old, would go on to have an excellent Test career, taking over 150 wickets for England and becoming one of the finest medium-pace bowlers of all time.